Welcome to the Fusionary Health Podcast. I have an incredible guest in store for you today, someone who I have deeply admired for well over a decade for all of his work in this space, Dr. David Perlmutter. Welcome, David.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Dr. Gupta.
Well, David, let me first share your bio with this audience in case they have not heard of you, which I think would be funny, but let's just share it so they know the breadth of what you have been doing. Dr. Perlmutter is a board-certified neurologist and 6-time New York bestselling author. He serves on the board of directors and is a fellow at the American College of Nutrition. He received his MD degree from the University of Miami Med School, where he was awarded the Leonard Roundtree Research Award, and he serves as a member of the editorial board for the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. He's also published extensively in peer-reviewed journals, including Archives of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and the Journal of Applied Nutrition. In addition, he's a frequent lecturer at symposia sponsored by institutions such as the World Bank and IMF, Columbia University, Scripps Institute, amongst others. And his books have been published in 32 languages. And if you don't know, he is the author of Grain Brain. He's the author who talked about how gluten is so problematic for us before anyone else really publicized and made it an awareness of ours that gluten could be the problem. And so many people in my personal life have read that book, changed their habits, and then influenced me to become gluten-free years ago, which was game-changing to all my gut issues that plagued me since I was a child. So you have impacted me profoundly in my life. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And I will say, the other message of Grain Brain way back when, wrote that book in 2011, 2012, was the threat of simple carbohydrates. And now we talk about these things called ultra processed foods. Back then we talked about foods that refined carbohydrates that would raise your blood sugar and lead to insulin resistance back then. And you're right, even back then there was pushback. There was a pushback that, the brain needs glucose, therefore we need a lot of carbs. And I said, no, it's not what the data is showing. And, nowadays, of course, I think there's been a lot of validation of that notion that when we challenge our bodies with higher levels of glucose like that, then ultimately the brain suffers. The body suffers as well, but certainly the brain too.
I agree with you. It's interesting. I think sometimes criticism comes because you're just so early in this concept with people and they don't realize what you're really saying. And it makes sense. Now we talk about it all the time. White rice, white bread, these foods are going to hit you. And that glycemic index is a problem in the foods that you're eating. And we need to bring the awareness there. So when it comes to gluten and the brain, I love talking about the brain. What are those key points that you want everyone to understand? Because I meet doctors in my life who are like, why are you gluten-free? Why are you following a fad? Gluten's not bad for you. And I look at them and I'm like, don't you think I want to eat everything on a menu or everything in the grocery store? Do you think I want to live this life where if I choose to eat a carb, it doesn't taste quite as good as what I knew it to be? I'm not making this choice lightly. It's a very determined, deliberate choice.
Well, let me say first, when we have a favorite breakfast place, and when you walk in, there's a glass counter, and the croissants are able to talk. They actually speak my name. David, and I look over, there's the croissant. Who doesn't want to eat that? Of course we do. I mean, it's comfort food. But then we make a prefrontal cortex decision that that's not really what I want to eat for any number of reasons. But, gluten is a situation for human beings well beyond that 1 to 2% of our population, and it's rising, that has full-blown autoimmune issues called celiac disease, for which exposure to gluten is really directly problematic, not just for the gut situation, but really throughout their bodies. We know that many people have gluten sensitivity. We call that non-celiac gluten sensitivity. That was validated in the Journal of the American Medical Association after Grain Brain was published, that this, a large number of people have issues related to exposure to gluten, and especially as a consequence of what that gluten can do to the gut in terms of gut permeability. And the consequence of that is allowing certain things that should remain in the gut to transgress the gut lining and then influence the immune system in a negative way by increasing inflammation. And then when we recognize what is the role of inflammation in psychiatric issues and cognitive issues, as well as throughout the body, we begin to put together the idea that here is a relationship between a component of food and ultimately brain health and functionality. So, that was foundational as it relates to the creation of the whole grain brain idea, the grain brain book. And I think you're correct in that over the years it was validated. When now people talk about it, and now it's not being a real outlier to ask if you're going to order something if it's a gluten-free option on the menu. And oftentimes, surprisingly, there seems to be these days. Still, though, with the gluten-free issues, we have still to consider the issues related to the carbohydrate content, especially the refined carbohydrate. And that's certainly quite evident when you walk down the so-called gluten-free aisle in the grocery store.
Right.
When you see the gluten-free pie crusts and bread mixes and desserts, etc., beyond the gluten, still got to consider the carbs. And so, that was, again, what was foundational about Grain Brain. It wasn't just gluten, but it was about the whole notion of refined grains and flour. Again, we didn't call it ultra processed back in those days, but the consumption of those types of foods leading to a significant and prolonged spike of blood glucose, which required a response from the pancreas to create higher levels of insulin, and ultimately how that led to insulin resistance and ultimately prediabetes and full-blown type 2 diabetes. Then looking at the relationship of, if you are a type 2 diabetic, what did that do to your brain's destiny by increasing your risk for Alzheimer's as much as fourfold? That was the thesis. And I think, we raised a lot of eyebrows back then, thank goodness. But now, as you well characterized, this is pretty much part of the mainstream conversation.
Yeah, and thankfully, part of the mainstream conversation is type 2 diabetes, type 3 diabetes. We know there's such a tremendous issue of dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and these issues. But I think people are still not acknowledging what you're saying, which is look at what you're eating, look at your grains, look at your glycemic index, and make a real conscious shift. And so you're right, when it comes to gluten-free foods, we've been able to productize it, and all of a sudden we've got gluten-free pizza and it tastes amazing at Costco, and gluten-free toast to replace it. But most of those foods, when I look, have way more ingredients than fresh bread or fresh ingredients. So how do you guide people on the occasional gluten-free carb, but really being
Oh, yeah.
cognizant of what is inside?
Well, always cognizant about what's inside, whether it's the occasional or not the occasional, because if it is the occasional, even more consideration for the content. So we have had, to be specific, on occasion, more so in the summer, we live on a boat, and we ordered these frozen cauliflower pizza dough thing that you make pizza from. And they're really thin. There's not a huge amount of carb there. It's based on cauliflower, and to which we add tomato sauce and vegetables, and presto, you have pizza, and it's a treat. Not something we do every day. But that said, I think that in looking at diets in general, I'm a far more inclusive, I think, than I had been in the past, and far more likely to ascribe to one specific dietary doctrine than I had been in the past. So I really want to open the door to being respectful and appreciative of being vegan, vegetarian, being keto, carnivore, paleo, whatever it may be, and look at dietary perspectives from a different angle, and that is, what is their downstream play or maybe consequence? And that is, be in a place of recommending dietary choices based upon how they play out in terms of your blood sugar, your insulin level, your size of your belly, your triglycerides, your fiber content of the diet in terms of nurturing your microbiome. So choose whatever dietary perspective you want based upon your appreciation of the science or your religious perspective, whatever it may be, all good. And provided it checks those boxes. In other words, it doesn't lead to insulin resistance, as measured by your fasting insulin, your A1C, your fasting glucose, your continuous glucose monitor, your measurement of your waist size compared to your height. All of those metrics, I think, are very important in terms of determining, is this a good or bad dietary perspective? And importantly, is there enough dietary fiber, which happens to be a carbohydrate, I might add, to nurture your microbiome? Is this a diet that supplies a lot of colorful vegetables and fruits, again, to nurture the microbiome and to provide those desperately needed polyphenols for your health and for your gut bacteria health? These are the things that we look at to determine then, are your dietary choices appropriate for you? So in a sense, this is a way of personalizing the approach to making a dietary recommendation, but it opens up the conversation to the idea that we can embrace a lot of different perspectives now in terms
True.
of how somebody may want to go in terms of their dietary choices.
True. And one question I get a lot from people is, I can go to Europe and I can eat gluten. I can go to Italy. I know this summer I went to Italy for a few weeks with my children. I wasn't perfectly fine on the gluten in Italy, but for the most part, I did quite a bit better than I do in the United States, where it's quite a severe reaction. So when you talk about this, is it all about the processing of our gluten that's the issue? Is it the formaldehyde and the glyphosate? Is that the issue? Or is it also the nature of eating that wheat in that way in the first place?
I think glyphosate may actually have quite a bit to do with it, and that might be surprising because wheat in America is not GMO. So the normal connection is that the seeds of foods are of grains of various crops are genetically modified such that the plant is then resistant to glyphosate being a weed killer. So you grow this crop and you can spray it with glyphosate. The crop is fine, but the weeds will die. But it turns out that as it relates to wheat, there hasn't been really the production of GMO wheat to make it resistant to glyphosate. So you're thinking, great, no glyphosate on wheat. Not true. Glyphosate is sprayed on wheat after it is harvested to speed up the process by which it is then dried and available to be packaged and utilized and shipped and sold. So the fact is that even though wheat is not GMO, nonetheless, it likely contains glyphosate, and that becomes a very big issue because glyphosate, this weed killer, the active ingredient in Roundup, was designed to kill weeds, but also has a dramatic effect on bacteria that live in the soil, such that you basically sterilize the soil. And the purpose of the bacteria in the soil is to help deliver and hold on to minerals and other components in the soil and deliver them to the growing plant, such that when you spray those crops with glyphosate, you get, anemic is the wrong word, but you get crops that look good. They're tall and they look wonderful, but they're very deficient in trace minerals, for example, because glyphosate not only sterilizes soil, but it acts as a chelating agent to really reduce the ability of plants to absorb things like zinc and magnesium. So the notion was that, well, glyphosate does kill bacteria, but we're not bacteria, so it's not going to have any effect on human cells. And it does not, to any significant degree, affect our cells. But it does affect bacteria. And we are a lot of bacteria. It may be as many as a 10-to-1 ratio in and on our bodies are bacteria compared to the cells of our bodies. So in that regard, indeed, glyphosate becomes a clear and present danger in terms of our consumption of that. This morning, after coming home, actually, was it last evening, yesterday, coming home from the gym, in my neighborhood, there's people walking down the medians with these of the road with tanks on their backs spraying glyphosate. And this is something that we're exposed to. We don't do it in our yard. We hope our neighbors don't, but we know that they do, and it's ubiquitous. It's hard to get away from that, but you got to do your best. It's why you buy organic fruits and vegetables. But so this becomes, to get back to your question, I think one of the issues that relates the fact that people oftentimes report that when they're in Italy or France, they're able to eat gluten-containing foods and have less of an issue with it. I think the other part of that story is that a lot of the issues people experience when they're eating gluten-containing foods are issues that accumulate over time.
Mm.
Unlike the celiac patient who's going to have a response within an hour or two of consuming gluten, they're sick quickly. They're having gastrointestinal issues right away. Those who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity oftentimes have manifestations that are days to weeks to even months down the line as a consequence of constantly exposing their bodies to gluten. And therefore, the idea that they went to Europe, ate the gluten, even though they don't eat gluten when they're home, and they got away with it in Europe, I think that those manifestations may take a few weeks, maybe even after they get home, till they start to feel those issues related to gluten sensitivity, which may in fact involve the brain, which may be mental health issues, as well as movement disorders and cognitive issues. There's a researcher at Oxford named Dr. Marius Hadjivassiliou, whose work I studied quite extensively in the writing of the manuscript for Grain Brain. Really, researchers who are making these correlations and doing interventional trials, taking people off of gluten-related foods and showing improvements in various parameters. So I guess that's sort of a long answer to the question of why people report doing better when they go to Europe. The other thing is, when you're going on a vacation like that, gosh, your mental health is just in a much better place anyway, because you're exploring novel things and you're on vacation and, having a great time. So that plays into it.
True. No, it's very true. I realized about a week in, I looked pregnant and I was like, oh, that's called gluten belly. You got it. And I quickly backed out of what I was doing, cleaned up my act, increased my protein, and shifted to really fresh pastas that would have less of a gluten impact on me. So I was fine. But just really paying attention to that. And you're right. We can come back from vacation. And in the past, I used to come back from vacation and think, gosh, I need a detox every
Yeah.
time. And now I don't feel that way when I travel, because I travel very aware of my gluten sensitivity.
But there's a lot more to this idea that you ate those foods in Italy or France and you didn't have such a response. There's something called the French paradox, where the French eat a lot of fat, eat a lot of dairy, eat the croissant, and etc. And by and large, their health outcomes are certainly a lot better than what goes on here in America. And I think the story is more than just the gluten and more than just the carbohydrate. I think a lot of it has to do with the amount and the types of fat that they consume. They're eating more saturated fat, and they're eating better, less processed fat, eating more olive oil, more of the monounsaturated fats that are good for us. And I think that has a lot to do with it in terms of reducing inflammation, as opposed to amping up inflammation that we would see with the consumption of a lot of seed oils. So there's more to the story than just the fact that some of the foods contained gluten and I ate them.
True. No, it's very true. It's that awareness of the quality of the ingredients we're using and the way that we're cooking, the mood that we're cooking in, the sourcing of those ingredients, and like you mentioned, the seed oils that are really problematic here in the United States. It's ubiquitous, but it's poisonous. And so
Yeah,
why
and I
can't
think
we
that the
create that
way that
shift?
we consume the food is important as well.
True.
You'll find when you're sitting in a restaurant in France or Italy, and uh, you're going to sit there and have a meal and talk to your friends for hours,
True.
and that doesn't happen here as often. They have their first seating and second seating and third seating. That's really fundamental for making the numbers. And things happen pretty quickly in restaurants. Keep an eye on that.
Yeah.
First course comes, second course comes. Next thing you know, there's the check, and you kind of have to pay it and leave. And
True.
what I find in Europe, when you're having a meal, you don't get the check until you ask for it.
Correct.
And you ask for it when you're done and everybody's had their conversation and their, whatever their tea or coffee is at the end of the meal. And it's a lot more of an experience in terms of a social experience than I think we typically have here.
True. It's a different way of life, a completely different approach.
Yeah.
So, David, one thing that was so exciting was I met you a few weeks ago at a wonderful conference here in West Palm Beach called Eudaimonia. And I got to run into you at breakfast, and I brought up that I teach Ayurveda. And I was floored that you have studied Ayurveda, you use it, have used it in your practice. So, will you share your journey to learning about that? And what are some of the pieces of it that you've loved the most that you've applied within your clinical practice and what you do now?
A lot of a lot to unpack there. Well, let me begin by exploring how I came to um, recognize that I wanted to expand my knowledge base and really explore Ayurveda. I had read Dr. Deepak Chopra's book called Perfect Health, and I had already met him and respected him. My wife and I went to we went up to Fort Myers, Florida for something or other, and we won a raffle of all things. There was a big drum with everybody. You sign your name, put it in, and we won the raffle. And they actually reached out to us while we were still at the shopping mall and said, "Hey, you won the raffle. You get 2 round trip tickets anywhere in North America." And my wife said, "Well, isn't that interesting? There's this Ayurvedic conference being held in Huntsville, Ontario, Canada." As fate would have it, we had a cottage in Huntsville, Ontario, Canada. And so it just seemed that that the path was being paved for us to go to this conference. I went to the conference, and it was very instructive in terms of what Ayurvedic medicine was all about. And after that, I enrolled in a course in Fairfield, Iowa, and learned as much as I could about Ayurvedic medicine. And what I found attractive about it was it began to understand that there are differences between people that tend to explain why they are predisposed to certain illnesses. And that was a first for me. This was long before we would look at somebody's genome and determine then what their risk might be of certain disease, beyond simply taking a family history, which is something we learned to do in medical school. And then beyond that, the idea that we could more deeply characterize these individuals based not upon their procrity or their how you would see them, but their vicrity. What was out of balance in terms of their life choices, in terms of what was manifesting, and how we could then target their program, mostly dealing with nutrition, but other aspects of their lifestyle, like their sleep and exercise, and when they did those particular activities, etc. And so I recognized that was important, and recognized that, for example, there are different ways of examining a person that could give you valuable information. I learned a process, and I could talk about it now, called pulse diagnosis. And pulse diagnosis was a way of understanding what might be going on in that individual's not only physiology, but pathophysiology, what may be disrupted in terms of their physiology, and allow me to understand then what I might do to put that back into balance. And I actually utilized a pulse diagnosis thereafter for decades in my practice without really kind of being open about it. And people thought, oh, he's checking me for atrial fib or whatever it may be. But I was informing myself, and it really helped me steer my recommendations for patients in terms of lifestyle issues, when to exercise, how to be more in line with how the 24 hours of the day might influence that person based upon how I perceive that person to fit into these various categories. So I found it to be a very useful adjunct to my practice. I didn't go all in terms of using Ayurvedic herbs, but in terms of the diet recommendations, the information that I would get by looking at the patient from an Ayurvedic perspective and pulse diagnosis very much informed me in terms of making recommendations to that patient, but kind of going, kind of operating in the background. At times, based upon the type of patient I was dealing with, I would be very open about it, but at other times, it was pretty much either a mainstream neurology approach, or as time went on, people would expect more of a lifestyle relationship with me, and it would influence those recommendations that I would make.
That's amazing. You just made my whole day. I love hearing the application of using Ayurveda's wisdom into your practice, and it just made me think what a beautiful world we'd have if everyone took a moment and understood the prakriti and vakriti, that doshic imbalance that they're seeing in the patient, and brought that texture and that depth into how they applied their care for us. That would be a profound shift in all of Western medicine, functional medicine, integrative medicine.
Exactly right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be through an Ayurvedic evaluation. That traditional Chinese medicine really does the same thing.
Correct.
And it's just the simple notion that it's more important to know the patient who has the disease than the disease the patient has. In other words, it gets you away from treating disease, and it gets you towards the notion of treating the patient. And that's much more valuable, in my opinion, especially prior to there being a disease. Being very preemptive and helping guide that patient to a state of wellness and disease resistance, rather than waiting and waiting until that patient presents with an illness and then hoping you've got a magic drug or something on the prescription pad that's going to help that problem. So it's very much, in my opinion, about being proactive, not reactive. And unfortunately, healthcare in America is not really healthcare; it's reactive, and it's illness care. So that's what the Ayurvedic approach really did for me. It's the idea of really keeping people well.
Absolutely. And I love Ayurveda for that. How were you able to apply it to neurology? Because to me, the study and the application to all of us for our brain health is so interesting. So I'm just curious how you were able to
It lent
utilize it.
itself extremely well, man. This could be a book. But with our understanding that one of the cardinal mechanisms that causes a good brain to go bad is inflammation, which is fire, which is pitta, that imbalances of that energy force of pitta, of fire, over representation of this pitta from an Ayurvedic characterization, is something that then translates for me to the idea of, where does the word inflammation come from? Inflammare, to light on fire. And interestingly, even prior to Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine talks about Parkinson's and dementia as being a liver issue, because in traditional Chinese medicine, the liver is where the fire in the body comes from. So to answer your question, it very much lends itself to understanding neurological issues and what's going on in the brain. So there are various aspects of the Ayurvedic evaluation, I think, give a lot of valuable information that's translatable to neurology.
Nice. When it comes to inflammare, as you said it, I thought brain on fire. Is that the biggest issue we're dealing with brain? Because I just attended a documentary on menopause that talked about cognitive decline in perimenopause. And I thought, yeah, that's a lot of us. We're complaining about brain fog and access to brain. So I know we have the serious stuff. We've got Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia. And we think of that, most of us in our 40s and 50s think of it as like down the road. Okay, in my 60s and 70s, that's a problem. I should probably be preventing it now, and I probably should have started that a decade ago. But the fire and the problem we're in now is has, and I see it all around me, 30s, 40s, 50s, this, it's almost like the brain is empty, like the brain is lacking the juice that it needs to function well. So what are the main key sources of that problem and that epidemic, in your opinion?
Well, that may very well be the last question you're going to need to ask me today, because there's a lot to talk about. So, the pillars are inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance, and they're all intertwined. Inflammation exacerbates insulin resistance and leads to mitochondrial dysfunction, which leads to increased reactive oxygen species formation. So all of these things play, a role and are vigorously intertwined in what makes a good brain go bad. So we could start anywhere. We could start at inflammation, and we could start at the gut, because that's where a lot of inflammation comes from these days because of our poor dietary choices. Back to, the ultra processed foods, the high refined carbohydrates, and yes, gluten sensitivity as well, leading to permeability of the gut lining, which then challenges our immune system with various proteins and other components that it's not supposed to see, because normally the gut isn't permeable. And when the immune system is challenged in this way, then there's an increase in the production of the chemical mediators of inflammation. We call them cytokines. These chemical mediators of inflammation make their way to the brain, and in the brain, these cytokines are really threatening to brain function, brain health, and make the brain less able to resist disease and decline moving forward. How they do that is actually quite interesting. We now, I think, are moving away from the notion that all the bad things that happen in the brain are a consequence of the bad things that happen to the neuron. The neurons really are where it's at, right? Where the money is in terms of the brain function. Those are the cells that decline with age, that we lose, and then therefore their connections called synapses decline with age, and then we become demented, and terrible things happen. Well, upstream of the neurons degenerating, and really a reflection of higher levels of inflammation in the brain, are the targeted cells called the microglial cells. These are the cells of the brain's immune system, the innate immune system in the brain. And these cells are exquisitely sensitive to an environment that has higher levels of inflammation that, let's say, came from the gut. That is a consequence of the foods that we eat. When these microglial cells sense those higher levels of inflammatory chemicals, they change. They become the evil twin. Normally, these cells are there nurturing our neurons, loving our neurons, nurturing our synapses, creating more synapses, connection between neuron to neuron, giving us the ability to learn new information, keeping neurons from degenerating, shoring up the blood-brain barrier, actually nurturing the growth of new brain cells, new neurons, a process called neurogenesis, when they're in their M2 or good twin configuration. But when they're exposed to inflammation, they change. They turn their backs on us. They become the evil twin. They become what we call M1 microglia. And when they make this shift, then they no longer nurture the neurons. In fact, they lead to the neurons' degeneration. They lead to the accumulation within the brain of beta amyloid. They digest away the synapses, the connection of one neuron to the next. They lead to a worse function of the blood-brain barrier, and they compromise the formation of new brain cells. That's what happens upstream of the neurons being affected by inflammation. So now that we can look at inflammation through the lens of how it's affecting these microglial cells, really lets us understand then why we've got to pay attention to this one mechanism, inflammation, because this now relates our good food choices or bad food choices to inflammation via changes in the gut bacteria and threatening of the gut lining, and how that inflammation then impacts the brain and ultimately leads to neurons degenerating and causes us to be at risk for cognitive decline. So, very important.
I have a question in there.
Sure.
So I completely agreed with you that inflammation is the root cause. I teach that all the time. And everything you just said, I talk about in relation to turmeric. I presented at A4M last year in Vegas on turmeric and curcumin for its impact on all sorts of diseases, but specifically, I talked about neurodegenerative diseases. So before you go on, just because I'm the biggest turmeric lover that there is, will you speak into the role that you see turmeric or curcumin playing going forward for our brain health?
Well, first, let me get to a place of recognizing that all inflammation isn't bad. So we've got to be careful that we don't want to shut down inflammation across the board. We need inflammation as a way of responding to invasion of viruses and bacteria and dealing with abnormally folded proteins, etc. So, a lot of the focus on turmeric has been because it's an anti-inflammatory. B, it increases the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and as such can lead to the growth of new brain cells. And C, because it tends to reduce activation of something called the NLRP3 inflammasome, and as such works within the microglial cells to reduce how inflammation is translated into changing those microglia from being the good twin to the bad twin. There are multiple mechanisms that are being studied as it relates to turmeric. And I think perhaps one of the most important pathways is how turmeric consumption, as well as the brassica cruciferous type vegetables, are able to target pathways within the cell that decrease inflammation and actually increase antioxidant protection. And this is through something called nuclear regulatory factor, or just certain pathways that bring this about. And so there's a lot of research, a lot of rodent research in terms of turmeric, and certainly some human trials as well that indicate that there is a role of turmeric consumption. Again, getting back to Ayurvedic medicine. I mean, the Ayurvedic texts have described the role of turmeric in terms of calming inflammation, and yet it's yellow. So there's, it's like sort of like homeopathic medicine, like treats like. I always was attracted to that notion. It's the color of a flame, for crying out loud.
True.
So the NRF2 pathway is something that maybe your viewers would want to look up. NRF2 pathway. This is a pathway that so many of our nutritional supplements seem to target. So many of our spices are known to be active through the NRF2 pathway. We want to activate the NRF2 pathway, and that's something that turmeric is really good at, along with the cruciferous vegetables and, gratefully, coffee as well.
Nice.
So as it relates to turmeric, I'm a huge fan. And a huge fan of incorporating a turmeric into your cooking. Yes, taking turmeric as a supplement. There are some wonderful products out there. Some of them are combined with other NRF2 activators. But I think the ticket is really using turmeric in your cooking. It is a rhizome. It's easy to work with. Not that I do it. My wife does it. You can tell because her hands turn yellow after she handles it. But I'm all in favor of it. And again, this gets back to Ayurvedic medicine as a way of calming the fire. Right. Now we can look at, looking at how turmeric reduces activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome, if you want to be technical, and that's going to be on the quiz. But how did that wisdom get there in the first place? How did various herbs in traditional Chinese medicine prove their efficacy in terms of Parkinson's disease treatment, and now we know that they act as monoamine oxidase inhibitors? Where did the knowledge come from? So the fact is, the knowledge is there, and I don't think we can turn our backs on it. And that gets back to, again, why did I study Ayurvedic medicine so long ago? Because it's my opinion that there is a deep knowledge base that exists, that is all around us, that we can tap into if we just are a little bit more open-minded, that really will allow us to be more effective as healthcare providers, because that knowledge is there. And I don't think that knowledge comes to those who first described it in the ancient Chinese text, like the Neijing, written in the 4th century BC, the Neijing, the Yellow Emperor, who used this knowledge body to create that text, or in the Ayurvedic literature either. I don't think that is through trial and error, through double-blind, placebo-controlled trials. I think that what is a better explanation is that these texts were written by groups of individuals who were able to tap into that knowledge base. I think the knowledge is there. waiting for us to tap into it. And as I get older, I realize that there are those manifestations all around us of the expression of that knowledge base, even to the extent that I now challenge this notion of Darwinian evolution. That I get how that works. That a genetic modification that is favorable is passed on. I get it. But I tend to also subscribe to the notion that the helical pattern of the sunflower seeds is not just trial and error, that somehow that's tapping into some wisdom that then informs that flower, that sunflower, to form its seeds in this pattern for whatever advantage that might confer.
True, absolutely. I love hearing you share about Ayurveda and how it's impacted what you do. And you brought up the things that impact the brain the most: inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. And I interrupted you because I wanted to learn about turmeric and what your thoughts are on it. Because I'm immersed in the science of turmeric constantly, presenting on it at orthopedic conferences and different conferences. And it's my dream to publish more science on it as my years go by. That's my focus now. And when you mentioned those four key pillars, I thought, wow, aren't we kind of screwed? In modern day society, we're setting ourselves up to damage our mitochondria. Insulin resistance, we know, goes up as we age, oxidative stress as well. So many of us are inflamed. So from your perspective, what do you reach into in the Ayurveda toolkit to help address some of those issues?
Well, I'll get there in a second, but let's go back and you say what we're basically in trouble because of those four pillars. That's part one of the story. Part two of the story is, okay, I get it. I understand these mechanisms. Now, what do we do about it, right? And that's the empowering part of of the knowledge base. So I think that from an Ayurvedic perspective, I think it's cultivating lifestyle programs for your patients, since you do that, that are more in line, that are more consistent with who these individuals are from your analysis of the types of body type and physiological type and subtypes that they are, and cultivating programs for them that are most in line with that. Because what Ayurvedic medicine teaches us is that disease is a manifestation of not living a life that's in harmony with your body type, which today we would call personalized medicine, right? It would be cultivating recommendations for people in terms of their lifestyle choices based upon their lab studies, not the least of which would be based upon their genomic profiles, where you could be saying that you're at higher risk for this, that, or other, therefore you should have a more ketogenic diet, or you need methylated B vitamins, or you need to cut back on vitamin D, or you need higher levels of vitamin D, whatever it may be, based upon your understanding of their genomic profile, and nowadays even their microbiomic profile, and certainly other more standardized or accepted rather biometric profiles that you're now able to get. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, again, that's been the personalized medicine approach since Ayurvedic was originally developed. The idea that first we're going to see who this patient is and what is best for that person based upon my analysis, understanding and talking to this individual and looking at that individual, looking at his or her eyes, her body type, and taking a pulse diagnosis as well, getting a sense as to what is the program for that patient that's going to best allow healing to take place, because we're aligning physiology to be more aligned with healing and dealing with illness, but even importantly as well, how to keep that patient more balanced such that he or she is going to be more resistant to those, what is called in Ayurvedic medicine, vitiating influences, and offloading those detrimental influences in that person's life, again, based upon your understanding of that individual from your Ayurvedic analysis.
True, very true. And it's so interesting because going forward, as we do so much more scientific research, I was just in India this year meeting with suppliers and researchers of new incredible ingredients. And the way that botanicals are now being studied in India is truly to pharmaceutical levels and standards, like the level of science. When we source ingredients, it's third-party studies. But truly, the research that's being done on the herbs is similar to how you would study a drug. And so I saw them studying ashwagandha, boswellia, celery seed, turmeric, all these ingredients, clinical trials, 10,000 patients. And what was fascinating to me was the data they were taking on those patients. I would love every clinical trial to take DNA tests, like you just mentioned, microbiome tests, deep blood work. But also, what if every trial now started including dosha quizzes and taking our mind body constitution into account so that we could then start to correlate all the disease pathologies that we see in that we're studying, but also correlate it back to dosha. And I saw that there is someone doing that with one standardized dosha quiz. And so I've reached out to them to say, hey, can I help you get this out there? Because what if we did have, just like when you build a clinical trial for turmeric versus NSAIDs, you use WOMAC and different study guides and testing quizzes and these things. You can also use dosha quiz as a piece of the data collection for the future.
That's a great point. And again, that's personalized medicine, right? And it's as if, all of a sudden that's a new thing, personalized medicine. No, it's been going on for, 3,000 years.
Yeah.
The idea of a personalized approach. Again, who is the patient who has the disease versus what is the disease that the patient has? We, in modern medicine, have disease-focused approaches. If you have high blood pressure, here is the drug to treat that symptom of the disease. High blood sugar, here's the drug to treat that. Not an understanding as to, well, why did that patient get it in the first place? What is out of line in terms of this patient's personal representation that leads to this mismatch then that manifests as a disease? So you're right. But I would say vis-a-vis your discussion of the scrutinizing analysis of these components that look at celery seed, ashwagandha, turmeric, whatever. I think there's a discussion to be had, though, about something called the entourage effect, and that is how those components are delivered in the natural state. In other words, who's also coming along for the ride? Where does one, i.e. the use of turmeric in cooking versus taking a turmeric supplement or eating celery seed with its fiber, et cetera, versus an extract.
Sure.
So I think there's something to be said about that, getting things in their, in the way that they're normally packaged in nature.
True.
For example, we talk about the value of eating an apple versus drinking a glass of apple juice.
Certainly.
Or carrot juice. People think, well, carrot juice, my gosh, it's got all this great stuff in it. But, when you drink the carrot juice and throw away the fiber was part of the entourage. It was part of what the carrot, how it's normally delivered, and is really partly involved with why eating a carrot is a good thing, as opposed to getting a pretty good sugar spike from drinking a glass of carrot juice.
True, but don't you feel right now the way food is made? Like I keep talking about this lately with the people around me. I eat really well. I eat turmeric every day. I'm Indian. It's in my food twice a day, lunch and dinner. Still, the level of inflammation, the level of minerals that are lacking, even though it's such a focused Ayurvedic, like I have fresh Ayurvedic food made in my house 4 or 5 days a week fresh. We don't eat leftovers. We don't eat dead food. All these factors are true. And so I teach a lot about curcumin and getting that high dose because I find we're not almost ever eating enough of what we need to. And
No,
it's
I agree
lacking
with
the
you.
nutrient density to give us what we need. You know what I mean?
I agree. And that's why they're called supplements, because they are designed to supplement or work as adjuncts to our diets, if in fact our diets are deficient, and our diets are deficient.
Right.
The soils upon which our foods are grown are deficient in trace minerals, and therefore mineral supplementation, I think, is mandatory, especially magnesium and zinc and copper. But your point is well taken. Do we get enough omega-3s or specifically DHA or EPA? The amount of seafood that we consume? Probably not. And what is the quality of that seafood as well? And therefore, I think that's another area where supplementation is really valuable. B vitamins as well, vitamin D, as we're told to stay out of the sun, I think is actually very important as well. And so I think there is plenty of necessity even these days to add various types of supplements to our nutrition because your point is well taken. The foods that we are consuming are not that adequate.
I just took my bowl of supplements about an hour ago and I thought to myself, this bowl only grows. The number of supplements I take only grows. I'm obviously in the world of supplements and longevity and integrative medicine, so I'm into the topic. But I just had that thought this week that no matter what I do, my blood work is running deficiencies. And I am eating spinach and beets like it's my job for my iron. I'm eating foods that are good for the brain. I'm eating foods that are good for the gut, the prebiotic foods. And so I almost felt hopeless. Like, okay, you can do all the work, but no matter what you do, you need that next level because no matter how you're sourcing, our soil nowadays, like you said, is sterilized, which is crazy. So it's like both and. We have to invest that time in the great food prepared well, eaten properly, slowly, and then simultaneously add those supplements in to get the rest of what we need.
Yes, in many ways, I wish it weren't the case. Because if I said to you that's just not the case, I'd be saying that because our food was really great and supplied everything we need.
Yeah.
This is not the food of your ancestors. This is a food that is deficient across the board in terms of some things that are really important. I mean, the macronutrients, I think we're getting protein, carbohydrates, and fat, in abundance. But it's well beyond that, that other issues, the micronutrients that are so influential in terms of where do you begin, in terms of so many processes in our physiology that are important, that are fundamental, that should have been there and are not there. I wish we could get it from food, but I don't think we can. And I think, as you mentioned, I think you inferred that proof is in the pudding in terms of your blood work. People can look at blood work and look at their trace mineral levels, look at their homocysteine levels, vitamin D levels, et cetera, red cell magnesium level, and determine, where they are in terms of what pretty much common knowledge would dictate is at least adequate, if not optimal. And the good news is, okay, if it's not, you can fix it. There are ways of supplementing the things that are really valuable for you, readily available. And I strongly encourage it. I take supplements myself every single day, and I'm glad that I do. Are they helping? There are actually very few metrics that you can use to determine if they're helping or not. One metric that is very effective in my world is something called homocysteine, which is a risk factor for brain decline. And my homocysteine was higher than I wanted it to be. And I know why it's higher than it should have been. It's because I have a genetic predisposition to having a high homocysteine. And it's something called MTHFR, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase polymorphism. That's a lot. But it simply said, based upon looking at my genetic profile, that when I take a B vitamin, it should be something called methylated. And if I don't take methylated B vitamins, I am at risk for elevated homocysteine and as such at risk for vascular disease, including of the brain. Started taking methylated B vitamins, guess what? My homocysteine became normal in the blink of an eye. So in that way, I was able to say that this particular type of supplement had a measurable effect on me in terms of a laboratory study. And, the truth of the matter is, you can get laboratory studies pretty much across the board now in terms of the various important micronutrients that we need to be taking.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to partner with a practitioner who will do that because if you're
Oh,
not
totally.
getting that data on yourself, you're flying blind. Like I just looked at my July blood work and I was like, did you address all of this? Because this was a lot in the red. And I thought through it and I was like, well, actually, yes, my supplement protocol on myself is phenomenal. My diet is phenomenal. Exercise, maybe there needs to be more in there. Okay, like let's see when my next report card comes, which will be this week. I just did a big stack of blood work where we're at. And then we can adjust. Is it more magnesium? Is it more zinc? Of course, it's going to be more D. I'm Indian. I'm always deficient in the vitamin D. And we have that opportunity to enhance and improve based on our goals, whether it's brain health, which I'm currently obsessed with in perimenopause, gut health, which as an Ayurvedic practitioner, I'm always obsessed with, or also our cellular health overall, as we've discussed today. So David, I know I can't keep you on here all day, even though I would love to, because I've admired you for decades in my life. Do you have any final messages that you want our audience to hear today? And then will you share where they can find you? And I know you have an upcoming book coming out, so will you share about that as well?
I would say that I think the most important issue to address today is our belief systems. And I think that my mission is to help your audience recognize that on the one hand, there's a belief that we can live our lives however we choose, and that modern medicine will create drugs or other interventions to take us back to health when we start to fail. That's to be contrasted with each of us recognizing that our choices, i.e. we are each the architects of our health destiny, even as it relates to the brain. So on the one hand, you can offload that to pharmaceutical intervention and eat whatever you want. On the other hand, we can regain agency over our health moving forward. That's really important. And that's what the empowering part is all about, is gaining the tools by gaining the knowledge in terms of what will work for each individual. My next book is called Brain Wars, and it focuses on two important issues. First, the dichotomy between these two types of microglial cells, friend and foe. The good microglial cell that's nurturing our brains and its evil twin. And the other dates back or harkens back to what I just mentioned, the war to dominate our thought process, our belief system, between the idea that we have no agency, we should do whatever we're told, eat whatever we want, and there'll be a drug to fix it, versus being in charge. Where to find me? drperlmutter.com. drperlmutter.com is the clearinghouse. David Perlmutter on Instagram, I think, and Facebook and X. But I think the best place to go is probably my website to start. Everything that we talk about, I've written about. There are blogs that are searchable by topic and interviews that I've done with people from around the world over the past many, many years in the Empowering Neurologist podcast. But then in closing, let me say to you, Dr. Gupta, thank you so much for having me. I so enjoyed having breakfast with you. And I just want to, hope that you continue to do all the great things that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. Thank you for your encouraging words. The architect of our own health destiny. That is something I deeply believe in. We all have this opportunity to be that architect and that change maker in our own lives and completely change our health destiny. I'm one of those people. I've changed it partially because I gave up gluten and followed your guidance in your books around building great brain health so that this master computer can continue to work for my longevity. So thank you for coming on the podcast today. Thank you everyone for coming onto the Fusionary Health Podcast. If you want any more information about this podcast, it's at drshivani.com, and we'll see you next week for the next episode. Thanks for joining me for this episode. Check out our sponsor, Fusionary Formulas, the potent turmeric supplement used by doctors around the U.S. for patients with pain and inflammation. www.fusionaryformulas.com. I'm your host, Dr. Shivani Gupta. For more, visit shivanigupta.com. Subscribe to this podcast in Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Click the follow button or subscribe in any of the apps that you use. That's all I've got for you on the Fusionary Health Podcast this week. You have the power to transform your health and achieve vibrant health starting today.